This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, thank you there. So while we're waiting for folks to filter in, this is the second webinar for the MassCEC Equity Workforce Implementation Training RFP grant opportunity. If you want, you can look at the first webinar. There is a recording on our website on the RFP page. And while we're waiting for folks to filter in, we invite you, if you're comfortable doing so, to put your name, your pronouns, your organization, and your contact info in the chat. We will be putting those who are interested in partnering and networking related to workforce development in the clean energy sector onto a spreadsheet and sharing that out in the near future. So again, please put your name, contact info, your pronouns, and your organization in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. Thank you, Karen. So we'll wait another minute or so and then get started. So for those who are just filtering in and may have missed the first message, we are recording this webinar. So if you do not wish to be on the recording, please self-mute yourself and please turn off your video. And again, this is the second webinar for the Equity Workforce Training Implementation RFP. The first webinar, the recording of that webinar is available on the RFP website if you wish to refer back to it. Okay. So since I'm not seeing anyone else in the waiting room, we are going to start. And as people filter in, I may have to just break for a second to give them the same disclaimers so that they are aware that, we are recording. So here we go. This is a quick look at the agenda for the webinar today. The main thing I'll call out is that we do have two sections during the agenda. First, right after the discussion on eligibility, and then later after the discussion on what we are looking for in terms of selection criteria, to ask some questions and answers. So we do have separate office hours, which will be listed later on. That are those are times when you can come in and actually ask, more back and forth questions, and those are on other dates that we will explain later. So moving on from the agenda, the first item we'll talk about is where is this funding coming from, and what is the sort of goals in terms of target population and target sectors. So this funding, it's a $12 million allocation every year that was legislated by the State House. And that started in 2021, so it's a fairly new pot of money. And the goal is to increase diversity in the clean energy workforce by helping out individuals from the environmental justice neighborhoods to enter into the clean energy sector. And if you're just joining, this is a recorded session. So I would ask that you please self-mute yourself and turn off your video if you do not wish to be in the recording. Thank you. So that act is working to increase the workforce because there is a recognized need to increase the number of individuals entering the clean energy sector to ensure that we meet the climate critical goals for 2030 and 2050. In 2022, that legislation was expanded to also include federally recognized and state acknowledged tribes and also underrepresented communities, and the initial act actually allowed for fossil fuel workers as well. The underrepresented populations in the clean energy sector is where there's some additional flexibility. So as we all probably know, the clean energy sector workforce right now is primarily Caucasian male dominated. So for example, you could try to write a grant that identifies helping out female veterans as an underrepresented population, for example. So I've already started talking about the target populations. EJ neighborhoods or low income communities, there is a fairly defined way of looking at that within this legislation, which is written out here. I won't read all of it, but basically it's about, the makeup of the neighborhood. If you look over to the middle of the page in the blue box, there is a QR code and a bit.ly link. If you follow that QR code or type in the bit.ly link to your browser, it'll take you directly to the state's definition of EJ neighborhoods, which also within that page, there will be a link to the map, which shows you which census blocks actually are qualify as EJ neighborhoods in the state size. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, we also are targeting the federally recognized or state acknowledged tribes, members of underrepresented communities, and current or former fossil fuel workers. So in terms of those are the populations we're targeting occupations in the 4 climate critical sectors that MassCEC works. So the first would be net zero grid, which includes, solar, microgrids. The second would be high performance buildings, so building electrification and retrofits. Offshore wind, which I'm sure everyone's heard a lot about. And then finally, transportation, which includes electric vehicles, electric bikes, and all the infrastructure related to that. So here are some quick examples of the various occupations that we're looking at. I mean, they're the obvious ones like electricians, the various trades that are needed to do building retrofits to install offshore wind. The ones I want to call out beyond that, though, so you can see we also mentioned customer service representatives and sales reps. So those are, entry points into the clean energy sector that you may not think of when you think of clean energy jobs. And going back even a step, electricians, for example, we know that a lot of electricians don't necessarily consider themselves as clean energy workers, but many of them are because they help install everything from the EV chargers to, heat pumps. So the RFP itself, if you go to this is a different bit.ly link than the one earlier, and this will take you to the actual RFP page where you're able to download the PDF document plus all the needed attachments. So the RFP itself, for this round, we have 10 million total available. Out of that 10 million, we are looking to make awards of up to 1.2 million across 3 years per grantee, and that's an up to. So if you have a proposal where you don't need the full 1.2 million, we obviously will entertain lower proposals for projects that need less funding. And the big thing is we are looking for partnerships. We recognize that workforce development is not easy, and that it's rare to find a group that can do every part of a workforce development pipeline under their one umbrella. So we really encourage that you come in with partners to cover all the various components that we'll be talking about later in this webinar. So again, I'll just give it a second so you can grab that bit.ly or that QR code if you need to. Okay. So on page 7 of the RFP, once you download, you'll see eligibility requirements. So again, we encourage partnerships. Within the partnership, though, we do need there to be a designated lead applicant. And that lead applicant needs to fall into one of the categories you see on the right. So, CBO, like a nonprofit, post-secondary institution, as well as vocational high schools and other youth programs. For-profit entities, we do, encourage employers who want to set up, pipelines to entertain that as well. Workforce development organizations, both private as well as, mass hire type organizations. Additional criteria that you should be very aware of, the lead applicant has to be Massachusetts based, whether that's having a Massachusetts office or having designated staff in Massachusetts. Not all partners within the partnership umbrella have to be Massachusetts based, just the lead. The lead applicant must be in good standing with the Commonwealth. We might ask you for a certificate of good standing. Plus, if you are already a grantee of MassCEC, you are invited to come back and apply. What you apply for under this RFP, though, must be separate and distinct from the other projects you're already working with MassCEC on. So here's just a quick example. You can see that, there's many different types of groups that can be in a partnership. any of these groups listed in the blue boxes could be the lead applicant. We're not favoring one type of organization to be the lead. But again, one group does have to be designated as the lead in the application. So you can see that each group could bring a different, a combination of services to the table. Like, for example, the CBO might come in with recruiting because they have a footprint in the neighborhood. And then, they may partner up with a post-secondary institution to provide the actual technical training while they're providing the wraparound support services during that training time. And then maybe you connect with a mass hire group that will connect you with employer partners that then sign on to do interviewing, to provide workshops during the training, to do placement, and then help with retention alongside the CBO, for example. So that's a very quick sort of example of how a partnership might come in. So with that, we're going to give a brief amount of airtime to allow you to ask questions. Feel free to put them into the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you're welcome to unmute and turn on your video. So does anyone have any initial questions about eligibility, target sectors, target populations? We will continue on in this webinar after this Q&A time to talk about criteria for the application itself, but let's give it a moment here. So I see someone asking about a copy of the deck, and yes, the slides will be available after this. I believe there might actually, and Camilla, who's one of my colleagues, Camilla, is there a PDF already up from the first webinar?
Yes, it is up on our RFP page. I can put a link in the chat.
Thank you, Camilla. Does anyone else have any questions about the target populations, sectors, or eligibility?
Hi everyone. Just a quick question. If we are partnering with a university also located in Massachusetts and we're a private sector, is it better that we apply for the grant or the university? Is there for that?
I honestly, I don't think there's a better, in this case, since you're both based in Massachusetts. I think so. When we get to the criteria, you will see that one of the criteria is basically the historical success of the partners under the umbrella. I think just from the standpoint of who should be the lead, I mean, generally whoever's taking the most burden probably would be the lead in terms of all the various components, whether that's the administrative filing of the grant, and then once the grant is put in, just keep in mind the lead applicant will be the organization that has to deal with invoicing, signing off on contracts, and all the other sort of administrative tasks related to a grant. So whichever group is best equipped to do that would be probably the advisable group to be the lead.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I think I see a hand up with Nicole.
Yes, thank you. I just came in a few minutes late, so I just wanted to go over again the target audience you're looking for. I know there's
Sure.
some conversation about post-secondary and those already in the workforce. How about students in high school or as you mentioned, in college or community colleges? Is that more so for high schools? Is that also something, a target audience there?
So I think there's two layers of questions there actually. So that we have target populations. So the groups, individuals that you want to service, we have four potential populations in general that are required under this RFP and the legislation, which include individuals from environmental justice neighborhoods or low moderate income neighborhoods. So that's one pool. The next pool would be federally recognized or state acknowledged tribes, so members of those tribes, current or former fossil fuel workers, and then members of underrepresented communities in the clean energy sector. So that includes, so for example, female veterans or even certain minority populations would qualify. So those are the general categories. And then within that, within your training pipeline, when we talk about the criteria later on, you'll see that we're open to different, subsets of those four populations. So yes, we are interested in providing career pathways for young adults and youth. Yes, individuals who are currently attending post-secondary institutions. So it really depends on what we're looking for is a comprehensive pipeline that's clear which target populations you are trying to service, and that the pipeline that you develop actually makes sense and reasonably addresses the needs of those populations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before I move on to the rest of the webinar? And I do see a few people join us midstream. So if you're joining us now, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. So please self-mute yourself. And if you do not wish to be on the recording, please turn off your video. Okay, so last chance for Q&A on the eligibility and target populations and target sectors. You can obviously ask those later in the tail end Q&A as well. But okay, so moving on. So selection criteria. So you can find this in detail on page 11 of the RFP document itself. You can see we are looking for various parts of the traditional workforce development pipeline, and then sort of the partnership. We're going to look into the historical success of the various partners in the partnership pool, and their track record working with the various populations they're targeting. So while we do value, workforce development success in the past, we also value, success in the clean energy sector. Not every partner has to have both. We just want the partnership as a whole to be able to come to the table with, a comprehensive history across the different partners in those different areas. And then we've discussed several times now the target occupations and populations. We want to see some clear mindfulness that if you're targeting, a certain population, that the rest of your program design matches the needs of that population. So as we know right now we're in a historical unemployment rate low, which means that we're not necessarily targeting the traditional recruits. We might be targeting untapped populations, whether that's individuals who have themselves chosen to take themselves out of the workforce, or immigrant pools who are less accounted for in some of the stats, or individuals who are underemployed. So getting them to pivot into the clean energy sector might require different forms of recruiting, might require different forms of support because they come with different obstacles. So moving on to the program design, as I mentioned, we're looking for a comprehensive design which address the needs of the populations being targeted, and also recognize the needs of the employers at the tail end, and actually trains for what those employers need in the occupations being targeted. Plus, you'll see in the later slide that we are very mindful that, again, these underrepresented populations have systemic barriers that we have to address. So we are looking for program designs that address those barriers through wraparound support services, who provide, that provide career readiness curriculum in addition to the technical curriculum, because we find that a lot of the failure points actually come at the point of placement or shortly after placement, where the expectations on the graduates are not necessarily met due to lack of career readiness. And then a clear plan of placement. And so just be aware that in the RFP, we do require 2 employer partners, and we do want copies of MOUs or letters of support for those employer partners that show at least some level of willingness to interview, if not greater. And in fact, our team being from the workforce world, we love to see a higher level of employer engagement where they help with curriculum design, where they help with workshops during the technical training to provide level setting to let participants know what they're really getting into in terms of the job. And also in terms of how they are working with the partnership to ensure that once an employee is placed, that their specific sort of needs are met. So we find that a lot of the failure points are stuff like transportation issues, issues with childcare, other barriers that may not be identified in normal recruit pools, but due to the needs of underrepresented populations should be prioritized when placed. And I see one quick question that popped up. So when I say grantee, I do mean it could be an individual organization, or it could be the whole partnership of organizations providing the services to these individuals. So, so moving on then, outcomes and budgets, we'll kind of go into that at length, but we do look at a per participant cost. We're more flexible than most other workforce grants out there, where we do look at about a $15,000 per participant as sort of the threshold. You can go above that if you can provide a reason, some substantiation and reasoning for that cost. That many other workforce funds do have much lower per participant standards. But we recognize that in the clean energy sector, you may be dealing with higher levels of technical training needed. Plus, we also want to recognize that support services are not easy, and that there needs to be some, investment in that as well. And then the final category, the diversity of approaches, is sort of a catch-all for, we want to recognize that there are different ways of approaching workforce development, and we recognize that there can be unique approaches that are just as effective as the traditional approach. Plus, obviously, if an applicant comes in, if a grantee comes in that is themselves, they represent a minority woman-owned business enterprise, that's a benefit because they understand, some of the barriers faced by these populations directly. Plus, if you propose different geographies or target populations, like if you're doing a wide region, that's also could be viewed as favorable. So moving on, and again, we do have a period of time to ask more direct questions about these criteria near the tail end. So as I was just talking about, we welcome, unique approaches. If your design doesn't fit into what we'll be talking about in the next couple slides, which are traditional models, feel free still to consider applying, because we're open to unique novel approaches. For example, we have heard that there's a need for raising awareness and helping map out pathways. So one of the big barriers is that folks may not understand how to get into clean energy, and even if they get into the sector, they don't know what the next step is to continue their career growth. So organizations is developing those clear maps, those clear pathways. That's something we would entertain as an application. And if you're not sure about your plan, feel free to email the workforce@masscec.com email that you see on the screen there at the bottom of the green box, or come to one of our office hours where we can directly discuss your concept and provide some feedback. So as I mentioned, one model, this is a traditional workforce development pipeline model here. So the light blue pipe in the middle is the sort of primary training, recruitment, and placement section. But there are actually two other arrows there that are very important, just as important. And I think someone just popped in. If you just joined the webinar, please self-mute. This is being recorded, and so please self-mute and take yourself off video if you do not wish to be in the recording. So the middle pipeline, outreach and recruitment, we're looking for a clear plan, how you're going to get to that target population you're trying to reach, whether you're using mass marketing, and obviously these are harder to reach populations, so we are looking for a concerted plan there. Next stage, intake and assessment. There's a lot of individuals who will be interested in these jobs and these training opportunities. How are you going to make sure that they're a match to these opportunities? How are you going to gauge how likely they are to be retained throughout the pipeline and succeed? I mean, just as a personal example, when I used to run programs, we had 300 recruits at one point, and then we whittled it down to 24 through a lengthy interview and testing process. And that still resulted in, some occasional difficulties or retention. So just keep that in mind. And I see some questions popping into the chat, which we will definitely answer during the Q&A section. Obviously, the technical training section. Placement, again, is a big thing, because what we're finding through our own work and data gathering, and I think someone is off mute. If you can, please self-mute yourself if you just joined. Thank you. Placement stage, we are finding that, again, the clean energy sector currently is dominated by Caucasian male owners and workers, and a lot of that recruiting is done word of mouth. And even if we place someone who's well trained in terms of technical skills, there might be a culture clash. and then it results in some friction, which might result in lack of retention, meaning that they don't retain they don't keep that employee on the job. So part of that is helping the employer get to a stage where they embrace the diversity change, that they recognize that some of these recruits might come with different challenges than the recruits they're used to, whether that's providing continued support for childcare, flexibility in hours due to that, or transportation. So that's the placement stage is more than just finding them a job. It's working with the employer to make sure that the success of the graduate continues. And that's where that upper line, the employer engagement, is very important, because getting to that stage often requires being partners with employers from day one of your planning process. So we really encourage you involving employers throughout the process, whether it's planning, development of the program, delivery of the program. And then of course, the big orange bar, the wraparound support, again, we're working with different populations, and each population will come to the table with different potential systemic barriers. And we want to make sure that we address those barriers early on and continue to address them as they go through the process. So again, childcare, transportation, housing instability. Sometimes it could be, English remediation. One of the funny ones that I dealt with was I did a building trades program, and we had a lot of immigrant recruits who were used to the metric system, and they just couldn't wrap their head around using fractions, which is what most construction sites use, in the US. So we actually had to run a whole sort of remedial fractions class that was like a career readiness class underneath there too. Obviously interview support, resume help, all those different support services that increase the chances of a trainee, making it through the training and then also continuing on to be successful in the actual job. So here's, I've already been giving some examples, but here's a sort of direct example of how different partners might slot into those roles. So as you can see at the start, every partner gets together and talks about what they're going to do, who they're targeting, where they fit in the pipeline, and then maybe the CBO. And again, the partners could be interchangeable here depending on their particular specialization and their expertise. But the nonprofit might pop in and they start recruiting because they're, they already have a foothold in the neighborhood. They're, a trusted face in the neighborhood. And then at the same time, they're, because they're a trusted face in the neighborhood, they're able to say, for example, we know that a lot of our target pool, they're not going to be on social media. They're going to be sitting at the bus stop, or they're going to be, writing the T. So that's where we want to reach out to them. And then the CBO runs an intake and assessment process. Again, I ran a process where we did 3 rounds of interviews plus a 4-hour test. So by the end of that interview process, you knew that the people who were still interested were, they probably were highly interested at that point, and they, were ready to go through the sort of rigor of the training and then the job placement process. So maybe a post-secondary institution that has an existing training, a technical training program comes in and they serve as the vendor or direct partner for the training process. Maybe like they provide an HVAC curriculum, for example. And then a job developer, whether that's mass hire or maybe a job developer on the staff of the post-secondary institution or the CBO, they begin shopping out the recruits to the employer partners to make sure that there's a job waiting for them at the end of the pipeline. Because that's a big thing we hear about, like workforce development pipelines that don't think about the placement until it's too late. And then you have participants who've just spent 16 weeks of their time, passing up on income, training, and then they don't get a job. And that's just really demoralizing and also just bad for the training program itself. And then at the end, the CBO or one of the other partners works with the employer partners to make sure that the graduates continue to stay on the job and that they grow in the job. And at the same time, underneath all of that, you see the orange wraparound support services. In this case, we put the CBO primarily because we normally see CBOs doing the social support services, but it could be any of the partners again that specialize in that. So they continue providing help with, food support, housing support, whatever the specific needs of the target population in that pipeline are. That's, that partner keeps that going throughout the process and even during the retention stage. So moving on to how do you actually apply? You guys are already kind of halfway through this. You're attending the informational webinar, which is in the big orange box. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we have open office hours. there are, I believe, 3 more sessions after this where you're welcome. They're drop in, drop out. You don't have to sign up. You just come in and you can talk to MassCEC staff about your thoughts, your proposals, to ask questions about the actual RFP. So please do take advantage of those, or you can write directly to the workforce@masscec.com inbox to ask questions there as well. Those questions, though, just so you're aware, and questions asked during office hours will be posted to the MassCEC RFP website. And then, as you can see in the white box at the bottom, the deadline for the RFP is March 20th. So you still have a little bit of time, but it is coming. So nothing will be accepted after midnight on that date. So please get your application forms in before that, 11:59 p.m. time on March 20th, 2023. Your application forms are due via email at the workforce@masscec.com inbox with that Equity Workforce Training Implementation Grant application in the subject line. So the forms that you need to submit, which are described on page 9 of the RFP. The attachment 1 is just sort of a sign-off form. Attachment 2 is the bulk of the application. Attachment 3, the budget and milestones deliverables. I have 2 slides after this, which kind of just highlight some things that you'll see in there. And attachment 4 is a sample agreement. It's what you'll see if you were to receive an award, what it might look like, the boilerplate language that your organizations have to agree to. Please be sure to read carefully the instructions in each attachment. We will not be accepting anything that's an additional attachment. Within each application form, there are word limits. We're going to read up to that word limit. So anything that goes past that word limit, it may not be considered at all. And again, you do need 2 MOUs from employer partners indicating their interest in being a part of your project plan. So I lost my mouse. Real quick, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you're going to see them in the attachment. I just want to call out in the budget forms, we do allow for fringe. The number that's put in there is a placeholder. Obviously, fringe in most places is in the higher 20s percentiles, depending on what benefits you offer your employees. So make sure to calculate that, as well as indirect costs. Use the 10% that's in there, unless you have a negotiated federal rate that's different than that 10%. So we are invoicing on a milestone basis and chronologically. So you'll be asked to put in a whole project budget, and then you'll be asked in a separate tab to put in a chronological budget based on when you will be submitting invoices. Please make sure that's chronological and try your best to follow the directions put in that form itself. Okay, so I mentioned the office hours and the future dates. To highlight here, obviously we're right here on the 19th, which is the second pre-application webinar. Where there's 3 more office hours after this, where you're welcome to drop in, drop out, and ask questions about the RFP, both technical and also about your concept, your project concept. So that's February 8th at 6 p.m., February 14th, 12 noon, February 22nd at 6 p.m. And again, the proposals are due March 20th before midnight. And then we will most likely make the awards by May of 2023. So again, just to emphasize how important they are, we want to get your feedback. We also want to provide feedback. Office hours listed here. And again, as I said at the beginning, for those of you who came in midstream, we are trying to promote partnership and cross-pollination, because that as our role as a convener in the sector, we want to make sure everyone succeeds. There's a lot of work out there. So we want to encourage partnerships. If you're comfortable, drop your name, your pronouns, your organization, and your contact info in the chat, and we will put them on the spreadsheet of interested partners, and that will be shared out. And if you have a question, feel free to email the workforce@masscec.com. We will respond to that as well. And so now this is the final Q&A section. We ran over a lot really quickly there about the criteria. Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or type into the chat. I saw some questions come in, so while those of you unmute, let me scroll back up in the chat. Let's see. So the first one, I see a question. Can a proposal include supervisory training in addition to entry-level positions? So the long and short answer to that, go ahead.
Sorry, what I was going to say, I've been answering some of those questions in the chat.
Yes.
At this point, we're on the question, if some of the trades require 5 plus or minus apprenticeships, how does this fit within the grant timeline? Will becoming an apprentice qualify as placement? Just in order to move
I
some
see.
of the
Okay,
questions.
fair enough. Thank you, Janelle. So if I'm understanding the 5 plus minus, is that timeline? Or Karen, if you're willing to clarify, is that, are you asking 5 plus minus years, or is that the ratio, or what?
Oh, yes, this is Karen, thank you. It is years. We've heard from local folks that, for example, to become an electrician or another tradesperson, you have to have, or I guess it's if you want to become a general contractor, you have to have 5 years of apprenticeship, and other trades have different timelines. But so, you know, they're not going to be placed in a permanent job. They're still going to be apprentices during the grant period.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. So I believe to respond to that, placement into the apprenticeship would be, an acceptable, outcome for this grant, because we do accept proposals which clearly state a pathway. So if, within the timeline of your implementation, your goal would be sort of more a pre-apprenticeship, or even, sort of the uh, leading young adults, or even, older adults into that pipeline, that could be acceptable. I mean, we have other examples that we know from some of our existing planning grantees that are trying, for example, to put individuals into a related job first. And while they're in the related job earning the money, they are training up to get into that pipeline, for example. So we're somewhat, while we have some rigor to what components we're looking for, we do welcome some some flexibility within, how you're planning to do it. So if you explain, the reasoning behind making that the outcome, we would entertain it. And then let's see. I'm just scrolling through the chat here. If someone has a verbal question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. So I see a question that was asked about cross-sector occupations, which is very important, since we know that there's a lot of occupations which could be considered clean energy, but are not necessarily as a whole considered clean energy, like electricians, or HVAC specialists, for example, are, many consider themselves just HVAC specialists. They don't view themselves as clean energy specialists. So I guess, and the question was whether let's see, an employer, if an employer partner can employ individuals in that role that are both directly and indirectly involved in clean energy development, is that sufficient? And I guess my answer would be, we are looking, the spirit of this RFP is to try to increase the clean energy workforce. There is a lot of need in a lot of those jobs. So what I would advise to applicants coming in with employers that are kind of more general is to just make sure that there's some clarity in the MOUs on the type of roles that they might be put in, and also have other employers within their pool of employers. Because I mean, we recognize that some of these jobs are the type of jobs where part of the year that individual might work in the clean energy sector, and part of the year they may not be working in that sector, depending on when the jobs come and go and the needs of the sector. So what we just want to do is do our best in the sort of the gist of the employer partner pool to make sure there's some roots into the clean energy sector, and that within the pipeline, there's some clarity that gives awareness to those trainees of how to pivot into the clean energy sector as much as possible. I don't know if one of my colleagues wants to add on to that.
Edward, thanks. I think that was pretty clear, but just to reiterate, sort of, we do have a recognition that in many of these roles, there's going to be crossover. That said, part of what what we would look for is, in terms of what Edward's describing, really increased intentionality in making sure that, that you're supporting and you're working with employers that are committed to clean energy technologies as a core of their business. It certainly doesn't need to be exclusively their business, as in many cases, that's not the common structure. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Jennifer. So any other questions at this point in time? We're willing to entertain questions about the RFP, eligibility, target populations, target occupations. And if you have questions about your specific concept, again, we do have designated office hours to come in and discuss project concepts. And the workforce@masscec.com email is also open as well to questions. And for those of you who, filtered in midstream or late, the webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to find a link to download the recording on our website shortly after this webinar concludes. There's actually already a recording of the first webinar on that webpage, and the slides are available in PDF format on that webpage as well. Okay, so last chance, no need to be shy. If you have any questions about the RFP, now is the time to ask them. I will give everyone, a short window of time, maybe a 10 count in my head, for you to raise your hand, unmute yourself, type a question in the chat. Oh, I see a hand. Okay, Wheezy.
Thanks for the extra opportunity to think through the question. I know there's been a response to a question in the chat that says you really want to spend the money on clean energy technology. A lot of the entry to some of this work is going to require some background pieces like, plumbing 101 or something. I just made that up, or blueprint reading or something that's more generic. Are you going to be like carving off the more generic training and saying not that? And so that's one question. And the other is, if there's a proposal that you think is something you might want to fund, but you have questions about different parts of it, will there be a conversation step with that applicant pool?
Okay, so for the first question, we recognize that these are pipelines, pathways. So, we don't discourage at all coming in with having some of that basic trade skills or basic skills training. In fact, sort of related to that, we really encourage career readiness training. So whatever format that takes for your target population. I think the way to temper that and make your application competitive would be to make sure that it's clear in your placement outcome, whatever format that takes, whether that's actually a placement to an employer, placement in a pre-apprenticeship, placement in an apprenticeship, or placement in a role where they'll have the opportunity to take further certification that lead into the clean energy role, the more specialized role. We are open to that as long as you make the case of that in your application. And then for your secondary question, which I believe was whether there's going to be interviews. So we do have a time period designated for interviews as needed. It's not guaranteed that we were going to, interview every applicant. It's going to come down to whether we need to. So, as thorough as you can be and as comprehensive as you can be in your application, that would be advisable.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll again open it up and give a 10 count in my head. So if you have any last questions about the RFP, the process of applying, the target populations, target occupations, or eligibility, now is the time. Otherwise, we do welcome you to come to our open office hours or send a question to our workforce email. Okay, I will give you back. I don't have a clock in front of me, unfortunately, but I'll give you back some of your time. Thank you all for coming out today. again, here is the email address for you to reach out to in case you have any questions or want to, send in your application early. So thank you again and have a good rest of your day.